And folks, the fun continues with World Building Con. Our keynote with R8 Salvatore was epically followed by a horror panel and then a political power panel. And of course, we continue to bring you the epic world building topics from the epic world builders themselves. And speaking of epic world builders, let me welcome three of my favorite. Andy Law is an award-winning tabletop games designer and cartographer and an excitable teller of tales. He's best known for the Warhammer Fantasy roleplay game, which he has helped design, write, illustrate, map, and produce for longer than he prefers to remember. And he has worked for literally everyone. And now he is the CEO of Rookery Publications. Thanks for reading us, by the way. Where he streams weekly, offering an insider's view on gaming, writing, world building, as well as producing some very fine games. Andy, welcome back to the World Building Con stage.
It's always an absolute joy to be with you.
We had you here last year. We couldn't wait but have you back. Of course we did. And of course, I want to say another familiar face, but maybe just another face from the World Anvil World Building podcast is the amazing Brian McClellan, an American epic fantasy author from Cleveland. He's known for his acclaimed Powder Mage universe and his essays on the life and business of being a writer. And you should check out his podcast Page Break, where he discusses life with authors and interesting folks. I've heard. I was on it. It was fun. Hey, Brian, how are you doing?
Hello.
Hey, we see you, we hear you, and may I say, I very much love your little epithet that you've given yourself there. Writer band extraordinaire could not be more true. Did I hear tales that God Glass 2 was finished? Is that the thing that I heard?
Yeah, I turned it in 3 days ago.
Congratulations. Folks, go check out Brian McClellan's writing. Not only did he write the very fine Powder Mage series, of which I am a fan, God Glass is his new series. You must go check it out. And speaking of awesomeness incarnate, who do we have next? It's Mark Truman. He designs RPGs by day and community organizers by night. He's the co-founder of Magpie Games, which produces amazing role-playing games like the Emmy award-winning Urban Shadows and the revolutionary Bluebird's Bride. And I'm particularly excited because he also designed Cartel. And we're talking about resources and trade. And I was like, but we must have Mark. Mark must come. Mark, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it is an absolute pleasure. Folks, we have so much to talk about. I'm going straight in. I'm going straight in with the questions. Does money make the world go round? Why are resources important for world building? Oh, I'm gonna kick off with Andy here. Andy, what are your thoughts?
All right, so I'm probably the only one here who is going to be coming from a cartographical background amongst everything else. So I will, to a degree, take that angle just so that I won't be hopefully stamping over everybody else's ideas and just saying everything that they will probably say as well. So I'll take it from a slightly more world-building angle in terms of actually building the world and how the resources that your world has to offer and the various civilizations, cities and towns and trade routes that build around them will significantly impact not just the world building, but where everything is. At its most basic front, wherever your resources are, world are, wherever they hide is going to be the first places where up pops the various little first settlements that your world is going to need. So, for example, basic stuff like fish. Everyone wants some fish. Pop. We're popping up our first settlements beside the coastlines, up by the rivers. Water is also your primary way of conveying anything that has any weight. So you'll find that the coastlines are going to be carrying our first primary trade routes, our small little roads coming out from these primary resources as they are moving elsewhere, as we slowly work towards our really bigger trade routes, where the resources that one part of the world has that the other part of the world doesn't have start being asked for. Trade will slowly connect all of these different points of resources. Resource 1 here, resource 2 there. They want each other's resource. Our first roads are beginning to form. Our first trade routes will form. Our first cities along those coastlines. And those trade routes, in turn, will inflate all of the various cities that go along that particular route. So your primary cities, as they consume these resources and produce these resources, will grow bigger. So you'll often find that the key locations where key resources are produced and consumed get bigger. The key cities along those roads get bigger. The key cities that hold particular passes along primary trade routes also grow bigger, because ultimately, not only does our trade route give us the primary routes towards our cities, it also gives us our primary route towards our first wars. As individuals start looking at each other going, hey, you've got iron. I don't. And that means we start getting our first political factions building. And you'll find that your world building, through just thinking about where resources are, where our rivers and our various water places that we're going to be hopefully shipping our resources along are, well, your world building will follow almost by itself as you start dotting everything about on your map. So a lot of people, when they make their first maps, to quickly finish on this one, tend to just kind of randomly drop things around or make the blob map that sits in the middle of their screen or their piece of paper that sits in front of them. And they go, yes, I'm winning. And they've dropped their first mountains on, they draw their first bits. But it's once you start considering the resources, where they are, and the settlements that will immediately start popping up around those, and how they will begin to connect, that you actually start getting through to the real world building. And as much as I love saying this, it kind of starts happening by itself. You don't need to be big and clever to work it out, because people are relatively simple creatures. It's all about the power over the resources and the connecting to these resources that people want. And ultimately, can I convey this heavy stuff from A to B? And if the answer is yes, that gives you your roots that you start to build. So I think that gives us a nice start.
I love that. Kicking off with where are the resources? That's where people go. Brian, how about your thoughts? Why are resources important for your world building?
See, so when I'm talking to people about writing epic fantasy, I oftentimes you have every author has a different amount of interest in the fiddly bits of writing, creating, all that stuff. I personally kind of bounce back and forth. Sometimes I'm interested in the fiddly bits. Other times that's really boring. I've got a story to tell. And honestly, I like to tell people that your economy, things like your economy, they don't have to work. You don't have to stress test this stuff, but it has to feel to the audience like it does work. And so, yeah, resources are important in that you have to have it vaguely seem like it's real world. You have to have the reader, even if you're writing, a character-driven novel, stuff where these fiddly bits really don't matter that much to the story, you want the reader to kind of get the idea that they do matter. And it's a weird little kind of tightrope to walk, making it seem like it works perfectly, even when it really doesn't. Like anybody who has read, watched, experienced these big stories, especially the really, really famous ones like Game of Thrones and stuff like that, when you have tens of millions of people like looking at these things like really closely, of course they're going to fall apart. That's just the nature of having one guy make a thing. You don't have a team that's making it all look really proper, unless you're Brandon Sanderson, then he has a huge team doing that kind of thing. But for most of us, it's a small team or one person just making a thing and making it try to work. So I try to tell people, like with any kind of world building stuff, I always say, look, put enough work in that this feels good to the reader, that it feels like they're in a real world. And really, once you've put that much work in, the rest of it is kind of a bit of set dressing. It's your own personal preference, all of that stuff. But that being said, the series that I'm working right now, Glass Immortals, like the main magic system is a huge part of the economy. It is like oil is to us. It's magic that is made and distributed and traded, and that's a huge deal. And so with something like that, I have to put more work in than I would have, say, in Powder Mage, where that's not really a thing at all. So really, it depends entirely on your world, and it depends on you as an author and what you're looking for to create.
I love that. It's so dependent on the medium that we're telling stories in and the stories we're trying to tell. What's important for the story, what's important for the world. Mark, I would love to hear your thoughts on the importance of resources for world building.
Well, I think both Andy and Brian have pointed to different types of fiction, I think, that are kind of coming from this. And cartography is really interesting in that it's trying to document a real place, right? So it doesn't even so much tell a story as try to take a snapshot of a place. And Brian's talking about characters, right, who have their own motivations, their own interests. And I think a lot about the difference between, and this isn't a hard line by any means, but the difference between sort of psychological fiction and what might be called sociological fiction. So, in the former, we get something actually a lot like Breaking Bad. We're talking about cartel, where you've got a background of sociology, a background of the drug war and things, but those things aren't at stake, right? The psychology of the characters is framed by this overall world, like Brian's saying. And as long as that is kind of compelling, like we believe, for example, that Walter White is sick and doesn't have health care, and the details of that are sort of fuzzy. Like, why doesn't he works for the state? Like, wouldn't he have health care? But like, this is an experimental treatment. Like, we're there. It's fine. It's fine. He doesn't have health care. And there's a drug war, right? And those things are true. And what we really care about is how far will this character go, as opposed to Game of Thrones, where a lot of the characters' motivations aren't coming from their psychology. They're coming from their position within their society. And oftentimes what I think is people feel betrayed in a series like Game of Thrones when maybe say there's, I don't know, 6, 7 seasons of a TV show that end up with a bunch of psychological drama that really were set up as sociological conflicts, right? And when characters start making choices that maybe feel authentic to the character, but not to their position or to their role, is when I think that you have this sort of train wreck, right? Where things stop being believable to me because either the psychology is consumed by the world and it's like, well, but why would this character do that? Or the psychology explodes outside the world and you're like, but that person would never do that because of their obligations and debts and relationships. And I think you really have to sort of pick, what kind of story are you telling? Are you telling a story where the characters are locked into this sort of society that they're part of and they can't escape it and they have to make the compromises within it? Or are you talking about a story in which the characters' psychologies are going to be explored and change and grow, right? And I think we've made games that do both. And unlike Brian, I have to make sure that I can tell an infinite number of stories in this box that I'm building. So we often joke that when we do a licensed product, like we make the Avatar: The Last Airbender RPG, we've got Aang and his one story that kind of goes through the world, and then I have to figure out how to tell 20 of those, 50 of those, 100 of those, which means we've got to broaden it, right? And finding out, are you broadening it so that there can be lots of the same kind of story as Aang, like lots of people who go and have adventures in the world, or are we broadening it by like making the world of Avatar more realistic and people being motivated by things like money and trade? I mean, no, that's not what we're going to do, right? Like, that's not what Avatar is about. But when I look at something like Urban Shadows, right, like one of the core points of Urban Shadows is that it's urban fantasy, you're in these big cities, and there's an open question of like, why would anybody care about money when a wizard can just make a briefcase of money in a heartbeat, right? So one answer could be, well, that won't last. Any magic you do will eventually fall apart, right? And Urban Shadows says, well, that's probably not realistic because it's supposed to be a big open world with lots of different kinds of magic. So I can't make the move that all magic will fall apart over time. So instead, we end up in this position where we say, well, maybe money doesn't matter to these people anymore, but what they actually have is some way of transacting debts between them each other, so that a debt that a wizard owes you is way more important than a briefcase of $500,000, because that debt could be anything you would need from that wizard, right? And so the actual fiction of the game is driven by the sense of resources that, in a weird way, Urban Shadows is like a post-scarcity economy. There's no shortage of stuff, but that doesn't mean we don't have politics and institutions and power and control. And it really puts the focus on those institutions and factions, as opposed to cartel, which says the drug war is over there. Or, I mean, the people who control the drug war are over there. We live in this box created by the drug war. And all that matters is the choices that your characters make within that very tight box.
That is so interesting. 3 very different approaches to resources as a way to integrate them into stories, as a way to integrate them into world. Very excited about the different ideas coming out of this panel. Let's talk about world setting and history. How can resources shape what has happened until now in our world? Like how the world has unfolded? I feel like Andy touched a little bit on this about the formative power of resources. Brian, what are your thoughts on this one?
So I mentioned Glass Immortals, which is the series I'm working on right now. So the whole kind of setting of that is that magic is created via these little glass baubles. There's a special kind of sand that is mined. There's this whole economy around it. The sand is mined and it's turned into these glass baubles that have different magical properties. You wear them and they basically enhance you as a person. And this basically runs the economy in this world. World trade, the first empire that really solidified the production of god glass is the most powerful empire in the world, but this is kind of spreads all around the globe. It's very 1800s ish. So you got an age of sail thing going on. Really like a lot of what I do for the setting is talking about how this material kind of has shaped the way empires form and the way everybody interacts in the world. And so the whole thing is that the beginning of book 1, we find out that they're pretty much running out of the sand. And this causes a huge conflict that everybody suddenly realizes, oh, wait a second. We've got this thing called cure glass that means that if you live in a pretty wealthy area, you're not ever going to have to worry about disease or injuries. Suddenly that's not a thing anymore. And everybody's like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to give birth to my next child without milk glass that makes me not feel pain. That's going to change everything. And so you have it on a very personal level, but you also have it on like an empire shaping level. And that's the kind of thing that you like to, especially with epic fantasy, which is kind of defined by the word epic. You kind of need to consider all the angles of how a society is going to react to a glut or a shortage of resources. And honestly, you look at our own real world and you see how conflict is driven by resource. We'll see how that works with fresh water over the next 50 years for our own lives. But that's the kind of thing you kind of have to think about and play with. And like I was saying before, you don't want to spend all your time on that. You're writing a big book with lots of points of views. There's lots going on. You need to engage with more than just your own world building. You have to have the characters doing lots of stuff. And so it's again, it's kind of a bit of a tightrope that you walk in terms of sprinkling this really cool stuff into the world to make it feel real and vibrant and make it feel like it does have a history. Because that's often an issue where you write a book and it feels like nothing mattered before what you're writing now. And that can really lose readers easily. You really want something that feels like there were thousands of years of civilization before this, and there's probably going to be thousands of years of civilization after this. And we're looking at a snapshot, and you zooming in on these characters, and this feels real and vibrant. And I don't know, that is super important.
Fantastic. And I totally agree. I think using a resource and using the proliferation of a resource to show without telling, there's all this history, it's terribly important, everything hangs around this, and clearly it has proliferated through generations. I think that's a really, really interesting way of approaching it. Mark, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question around how much world setting and history do you need, and where do these conflicts come from, and how deep do you want them to go? And again, I think one of the biggest differences between designing games and writing books, which is again why so many game designers who decide to write novels are struggle, I think, as novelists, is our brains get built as game designers around creating arenas of conflict, not individual conflicts, not one story with one conflict, but one whole big arena of conflict. And when I think about this, what you made me think about, Brian, is actually in Dragon Age. The conflict between the Templars and the mages, which is interesting in that you might not see it as a resource conflict, but it 100% is about resources. So when we introduce these characters, usually it's in Dragon Age 1, it was either you were playing a mage or you were playing somebody who was not a mage and you came to the mage tower. What you're introduced to is that the Templars are like the security forces of the mages. But that's not really the whole story. The story is they're actually like the jailers of the mages, because any mage at any time, despite their power, could basically sell their soul to a demon and become a monster. And so the Templars are sitting there waiting for these mages to become monsters. And it's really easy to go into that and be like, okay, yeah, we have this one conflict with this one mage. But like what they really did was set up a whole bunch of different stories. What happens when a mage falls in love with a Templar? What happens when a Templar has to kill a mage they think is innocent? What happens when a mage makes that deal and hides it, right? Like all of those other little conflicts, the archetypal conflicts, are built into the fact that these mages are a resource. Their power, which is not money or ore or gold, it's magic, has these dangers that come with it, and those dangers have to be managed by that society. And so later we meet the Qunari, who are a completely different culture, and their attitude is like, well, yeah, if we have a mage, you just rip their tongue out, like make them slaves, because like they're way too fucking dangerous, so we're just not gonna do that, right? And like that, you're horrified, but you're also like, wait, but is it really better that the Templars keep them under lock and key? And so as the series has gone on, that conflict has matured and grown, but in my opinion, it's never settled the way it would in a book. It's never been about the one Luke Skywalker mage who changes everything. It instead stays at the level of the institutions. And the one thing I would say is really different about my perspective often is that I think thinking about resources is really useful, but most scarcities are not actually the result of scarcities of a resource. They're the result of the institutions around those resources. So, the joke here is kind of like, why did the Irish potato famine happen? They're surrounded by fish. It's like, well, actually the British caused the Irish potato famine. So like, that's actually a thing that happened. You can read about it. You can read about the institutions that had a role to play in that. And you can ask yourself, am I presenting institutions in my world that have both internal conflicts like this mage and Templar thing, but also act to reinforce power, which is what a lot of institutions actually do. And those resources then become tools, or sometimes even weapons that can be used against the other institutions and other peoples that exist in that setting.
Yeah, absolutely. Andy, I see you nodding along. What are your thoughts on this one?
My thoughts were actually going along a very similar line, you thief of ideas, you. Particularly because also I'm doing an awful lot of game design on my side, where it is often about trying to create worlds that include large, overarching conflicts that can be taken by individual players, GMs, or whatever it is, according to the setting at hand, to create their own personal conflicts within it. So unlike, say, for example, storytelling directly, where you are hand feeding an individual case-by-case conflict, you're instead saying these are all the things that could happen, and you're attempting to inspire somebody else to create their own conflict. Anyway, moving down onto resources specifically, they can not just directly shape the world setting and history, they can be largely responsible for exactly how it pans out. Just to give some loose examples and then some specifics. Say, for example, you've got yourself a nice base resource, like, say, gold in Demdar Mountains. That can very quickly turn into local cultures that perhaps even have a certain religious let's say, bent towards said gold. It can be the formation of a religion in that particular area. And as trade for the scarce resource, the gold that they have and others don't, then spread out from those areas, it's not just the gold that moves with it, it's the ideas. Ideas move along trade routes. Ideas move with resource. And our primary trade routes are also going to be our primary importers and exporters of ideas. Now, ideas may not be an automatic, is that a resource in my game? It absolutely is. And I think that speaks directly to, for example, the conflict between our Templars and our mages in Dragon Age. The various ideas that have been exported from, say, the different empires there, the Tevinter Empire, and how their ideas work down through the Dragon Age setting there. And I think that thinking of your initial resources, how it creates the cultures, how those cultures then spread, the conflicts that arise out of those cultures, and then the primary cultures that begin to become dominant and have a route, for example, to get through the ocean to somewhere that's weaker. And then you suddenly have opium wars. As you look towards core resources that others are attempting to secure because of the benefits that they bring to their particular culture, and they move into another culture that don't necessarily have the resources or the ability to either A, stop them or want to stop them because of the great trade that is then opened up as they begin to exchange and get rich out of the resources that they have available that are being exported elsewhere down trade routes that might be not naturally obvious because they're, say, for example, an ocean trade route, but a trade route that can be dominated by a primary civilization that holds that. So, loosely speaking, can it shape your game world? Absolutely. Think about where the resources are and the cultures that work around these resources. And as I say, right, with my first answer, the world building sort of just follows on. You can almost just go hike it back to the beginning. I've got resource X, Y, and Z, and then just build the story of those three resources if they're the core point of the world that you're building, because the conflicts over those will start to build cities, will start to build trade routes, will start to build your core conflicts, the ideas and religions that spread out from them as they then butt against each other and the wars that inevitably follow. So loosely, yes.
Andy, it's like you're reading my notes. Honest, I've got the Opium War, the Silk Road. I would like to flag when we're talking about moving items, moving resources, and ideas. It's not just ideas in a general sense. It's technologies, it's religions, it's also diseases, it's also pollution. It's also like there's so many side effects of resources that can become a front for conflict or can create an environment in which there is conflict. What happened with the Silk Road? The Black Death. What happened with the Black Death? Complete lack of population. What happened with complete lack of population? Power to the working people because there weren't very many of them anymore. Bonanza, we have a story. That all comes from the Silk Road and that all comes from trade. It's a lever you can pull. It's stuff that you can play with as you're mapping out your world. And all you need to say, what if this and this and this? And suddenly you have a beautiful backdrop with lots of complications that is a wonderful setting for a story. You don't have to go that far back. But there's so much that comes. Resources have a lot of baggage, is I think what I'm saying here. Like there's a lot of fun stuff that you can play with, and some of that can be accidental, like the Black Death, and some of that can be more intentional. So there's again a lot of spaces that can be read into. What lengths will people go to obtain a resource, and how can this bring conflict to your setting? We've talked about the Opium War, but I want to talk to Mark. Mark, what are your thoughts on this one? What lengths will we go to?
I think that a lot of talking about resources can there's a danger here in defaulting to like gun germs and steel kind of thinking about resources, and I think Jared Diamond is not particularly well respected within the archaeological and sociological communities because his work is kind of sloppy, and it kind of starts with this idea of like technology drives everything and wars are inevitable between people and that's just how things work. And so now I'm going to look through that lens and show you how I'm going to cherry pick some things, right? So certainly that happens, like definitely happens. And one of the things when I work a lot with indigenous communities here in New Mexico, one of the things that's often kind of funny about how we see indigenous people is we see them as like so spiritual and authentic and peaceful, and it's like actually they had just as many conflicts as any other humans within their their spaces, right? But those conflicts might have looked different. They might have had different characters. They might have had different rules. And so I think that ultimately this is a question about culture, not necessarily about people, right? People do all sorts of different things, but the cultures that they have really drive a lot of how they see conflict. And so to some respect, I think that the joy of trying to work resources into your setting is to ask, well, what culture would grow up not because of that resource? I think that can be a little dangerous. You're like, well, because they have magic, they all think this way, right? But what is the culture that arises because people make culture? So again, to look at Dragon Age, we have some human allegories where Ferelden's kind of British and Orlais is kind of French and Tevinter's kind of Roman, which would make it, I guess, Italian kind of. But the real idea there is that like those peoples don't all think the same about conflict, about what's necessary, about how things work. And so from a game designer perspective, again, I some days I envy Brian with you just got to find a really great conflict, right? What's great about Orlais, for example, is that like France has many times, it has a lot of legitimacy issues. Who is the legitimate leader? How does legitimacy get established? And legitimacy kind of lies adjacent to resources. Resources might be a cause of legitimacy, but it's very unlikely that somebody's going to be like, because we have gold, we think about all gold as being what makes something legitimate. That's a really thin view of culture. And so I think that like there's a chemical thing here, right? That our goal as creators is to introduce sort of a set of logical institutions. Like if there's gold, then there must be some institution that's getting the gold out of the mountain and into the economy. But then to allow there to be some weirdness, right? For example, Baltimore was one of the last places in the United States to get rid of slavery because it was in the North, which means the Emancipation Proclamation didn't cover it, but it wasn't particularly eager to get rid of slavery. And so it maintained slavery longer than many of the Southern states, which is like a weird kind of one-off that's exactly where you can have a lot of really cool conflict, right? Around the people who live there in this weird overlap between history and the current moment. And so I think I would kind of challenge writers to say, number one, yeah, there's a logic to all these things that are happening in your world, and they have to make sense and be believable. They need to seem, I don't know, Brian, if you would say authentic, they need to seem true to what's happening in the world. But your goal as a writer and a creator is to create that chaos that actually deepens that authenticity and says, there's something going on here that is out of sorts or out of character, or that is cutting across, and most of the Dragon Age games do this, cutting across the current cultural conflicts and casting them in a new light and creating areas of opportunity. And it just kind of reminds me of the what is the quote? Sometimes weeks feel like decades and decades feel like weeks, right? Like sometimes time moves very slow, and then all of a sudden everything happens all at once. And when we have a setting like Cartel, where you're in the middle of the drug war, my supposition is that most of the time when the camera is not on your character, everything's going as normal. But when the camera is on your character, it's like the worst day of your character's life. Like this is the day that's worthy of telling a story about, right? And when we're playing D&D, I don't think that's probably as true. But I think that there's something here for you as a creative where your world building should never have a kind of ruthless logic to it. It has to be a combination of the logic of resources and trade and societies and the illogic of people and their cultural, religious, passionate, psychological needs. And that intersection is where there's a lot of really great stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Andy, I see you nodding vigorously. What are your thoughts on the subject? Oh, we have lost your audio there, Andy.
It's okay, I'm back.
There we
that was
go.
me. I was on mute, so I didn't make any nasty noises in the background. And yes, you did it again. You covered much of what I was going to say. You rock. So loosely, I'm going to go in a different direction again then, so that I give a slightly different answer. To what lengths will people go to obtain their important resources? Right. So for the first definition is what's important, and that will be very different for different peoples and different cultures. At our basic level, shelter, food, basic stuff to cover ourselves so we don't die. And that may sound like the most basic of beginnings, but it is from here that we build from. Here is our foundation points. Because if you don't have enough of that, conflict is already beginning as you look elsewhere to try and find that. And if somebody else has it and they're not willing to share, conflict has begun. And then we just build up from there taking it step by step as we add our, and I think very good points here concerning institutions, whether our religions, our various groups, our companies, what are their, each of their individual motivations. And once those motivations are in place, say, for example, get as much money as possible, suddenly all potential resources that are within their range become important and they can be turned into some cash. So they will start making outreach to try and take it and pull it in, while others attempt to defend against this. Conflict between business, conflict between countries, conflict between basically everyone, right down to the fundamental level of, can I put some clothes on my back, of conflict? And that is, you have something that I want, and can I help you have it, please? And if they say no, the conflict has begun. And understanding what the resources are within your setting and what the cultural impact of those resources are for the individual communities, the individual institutions, will not just drive conflict and stories, it can basically drive the engine of your world as all the peoples rise and fall, some of them acting more peacefully than others, some of them acting more aggressively than others, according to their individual mores, exactly how they themselves express. And you'll find that they will also change over time. And if you're building a quick sketch out of your world and the different conflicts that it has, you'll find those that are oppressed will begin to change their views, as the fact that they're being oppressed makes them realize that the values they hold are either A, too difficult to hold on to, and thus they start rebelling in a variety of ways that many would deem to be unacceptable, or alternatively, their core beliefs are what define them. And thus they don't change, and they aggressively don't change, which can be just as much of a source of conflict as the alternative. And it also allows you to re-examine the core institutions or cultures you have and look at the internal conflicts that they have within themselves. As was suggested already, people are not one big homogenous mass. I come from group A. That means I think like this. No, there's constantly an internal churn of different opinions as to how different conflicts should be resolved. Some who favor peace, some who favor direct action, some who favor being exceedingly, let's say, grim and just taking what they want. Others who are like, no, let's just do it gently and carefully. And all of that at its heart is driven by the resources that they themselves are attempting to take hold of. If they live in a nice little corner of the world with no one around them, those resources at subsistence level don't bring the conflict. But of course, it's when all the groups move together, all the different cultures, the different institutions, the different thought processes, many of which may be very different to each other, that they start looking at things and going, well, I'm in the right here, I will take. Case in point, British Empire. Take a look at that and then apply that to the world. And it all...
It's been an awkward day for the British Empire. We've just been discussing colonization, and now we're discussing the East India Company. What am I going to say? World building, how to do it wrong, the British Empire. Speaking of characters and how far they will go, Brian, I'm super curious to hear this from a writer's perspective. How far is it realistic for a character to go or a people to go to obtain a resource? And what does that tell us about the character?
Oh, man. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can look at that. I think a lot of it kind of comes down, like from a character building perspective, it comes down to need. Les Mis is a very different book if Jean Valjean starts off by stabbing somebody to take their money to get a prostitute. Like, rather than stealing a loaf of bread to feed his family, like that's a very different character suddenly, and in a very short action. That action can take a paragraph, and suddenly you've set up an incredibly different character for the rest of the book. And so need is a huge proponent of is a huge part of that. If the important resource is food, then we as like human beings, as readers, we're a lot more forgiving about crimes that are done for survival rather than crimes that are done for luxuries or to dominate others, things like that. And so, yeah, you're totally heading in a different direction depending on whatever is driving the character to obtain that resource. And honestly, that can that can kind of apply even on the macro with the bigger things. If you've got a country that desperately needs one resource to survive in a world of very harsh, fighting amongst bigger countries, then we're a little more forgiving of that country having, draconian laws about, pigeon poop, for instance, is a thing that was declared part of, value to the crown because it's used to make black powder. And that's how you wage war. And so you've got a lot of perspective that you can bring to the need of the character or the group that is going after that resource. And kind of the bigger you get and the less survival oriented you get, the kind of the less sympathy you're going to have from the audience. But also that drives great conflict for a writer, and it drives real world conflict. I mean, the fact is that, we live in a world where we have large countries full of very smart people trying to figure out how to get to a resource first. And that drives a lot of the conflict. I was kind of thinking about the way that we have this sort of vague thing of online data being a resource now, and it's super important, but like the average person kind of scratches their head and says, okay, yeah, I guess I can see why it's important, but it's, unless you have a large entity dealing with that, it's not that important. And it's kind of a weird perspective to take as an individual and to try to work into your writing, because you get kind of these resources. I loved what you guys were talking about earlier as like ideas as a resource, religion and technology and stuff like that, because that gets kind of weird in terms of how it spreads and how people either reject it or take it on, or maybe even like see it religiously when another culture doesn't see it religiously. And suddenly, you've suddenly got all of the, all you have need is changing, especially when it gets into these ideas like religion, where, you don't need this thing to survive, but you need this thing for your spiritual survival within your personal belief system. And then things get really weird really quickly and really interesting. And you start delving from very hard resources like gold. You can very quickly start diving into these ideas that and they get very abstract and strange, but still feel very human to all of us.
Absolutely. I have such a wonderful panel here who's bringing such different perspectives to the table. It gives me such joy. And I want to bring this final question because I feel like we have 15 minutes left on this panel, and I feel like we're going to need it for this question. Trade and resources is such a huge subject. What are your sort of final ideas and advice really for our world builders on approaching this all without getting overwhelmed? We've touched on gold and opium wars and potato famines and religious needs and being the first to a resource, and not to mention all the baggage that goes with resources. There's a lot going on there, and that's even when you haven't built out your entire fantasy periodic table, which is a possibility as well. Andy, what are your thoughts on approaching this strategically, not getting overwhelmed, and having it bring value to your final book, your final setting?
Yeah. So to ensure we don't get overlap, I'll jump back to the map, because that's, I think, a good place to begin, because it's somewhere that a lot of world builders do like starting with. They get an idea of their map, they get their lovely little world, they get their first cities, they get their first ideas for what the various countries might be. And often, all too often, their first thing is, I will make country A country B, and country C with capital 1, 2, and 3. And they don't really have much thought as to why they are where they are. They just drop them on and perhaps go, oh, wait a minute, it's a city. I better put a river beside it. So they drop a quick river on it and they're like, yeah, okay, I'm doing good. And this is very typical for your beginning world building. And that's good because you're started and you're off. It isn't, however, taking into account today's point, which is resources and how it can influence your world building. So if you wish to try and incorporate these things and you want to go a little bit further than just, here's my big map and I've put a big wrecked bit at the top because that's where the big war was, and a little bit further than that, take not 50 resources, not 45 or even 5 or 6, just drop 3 or 4 core important ones. Assume the rest are there. Our primary metals, our primary ores. We're not going to be shipping cows from one side of the world to the other because if you've never had a beef burger before, you don't care. So you don't need to worry about exactly where the animals are in your world because everybody's got them. What you're looking for is something relatively unique. And that could be, as we've discussed already, an idea. That could be a core resource for your setting, whether it is something like a rare metal or some alternative. Once you've got those 3, drop them on. This is where the resource is. Once you know what that resource is, you can also determine whether there is potentially an extra source or 2, whether it's only in one part of the world or in other parts. And from there, use that to start building your world outwards along its core trade routes. Think about exactly what connects to what and which one of the various small civilizations that you're building will gain dominance because of their location and because of their access to the resources that they have. And you will quickly find that out of this, one culture will look like, hey, wait a minute, this one's on an island. It's got access to the sea. It needs the sea to do everything. So thus it's going to push towards technology that allows it to trade with others, which means we're going to have ourselves a shipbuilding nation here. And this resource is over here and no one else has got access to it. And I've got a big pile of mountains between that resource and the rest of the world because I just drew some mountains there because, hey, you're world building. You've just started off. That's where my mountains are. And you look at that and immediately you go, well, that's going to connect this way and that way. And suddenly you're doing much more than just thinking about, I'll draw a quick blob with a town in it and a river. And you're thinking about the geopolitical nature of your world. And that's purely because you've just dropped 3 resources on. Now, 3 is obviously an arbitrary number. You could choose more. If you wish to add extra complication, go for it. But loosely speaking, just 3 is a really nice starting point because it will immediately begin to form not just your primary trade routes, but where all the big cities are going to be along those routes, where it's most likely you're going to have your main, say, shipbuilding empires, where you're going to have your main capitals. All of these things start to form. And then if you add just a 4th resource, perhaps one that you've decided has come later, been discovered, the technology to extract it has come later, you can drop that on and suddenly just imagine how that impacts the rest of the world as it spreads outwards. You can literally, just by faffing about on a map, which is a lot of fun for someone who likes doing some mapping, faffing about on that map, blob it around, drop some cities, think about it a little bit, take a few notes, and your world building will be so much deeper if you take into account the resources and the ideas that come from these resources and how it exports over the rest of your map.
I love that. And that really ties back to what R.A. Salvatore was saying in our keynote about, working it out, making it make sense. If this, then what? That was a real fundament of the keynote, and we've heard it in every panel today. Work it out. If this, then what? Mark, what are your thoughts on this? Final tips for our world builders approaching this very weighty topic of resources without running to a corner and crying?
Yeah, well, I think Annie did a great job there of giving a lens, right? So I'll try to do something similar. I think one thing we haven't talked about much because we've been focused on sort of like a representation of the real world, right? Of trying to bring some authenticity and detail, is the idea of genre, right? Because the genres that we're talking about are really different. And I love that, Brian actually met in Poland at a con. And so we've talked a little bit about some of this stuff before. I was really happy to see you on the panel, Brian. But like every other sentence, he's like, well, in epic fantasy, right? Because like, that's the thing he knows, right? And like, I think it's really smart because it's like, look, the stuff that's going to work for Brian in epic fantasy, if you take that to urban crime fiction, is going to be kind of radically out of sorts, right? Like urban crime fiction takes our world. It's supposed to be our world. It's supposed to be the world you know. And so therefore the details and world building are your world. And anything we add to that has to fit in with the logic of our world. If there's a crime boss that runs all the crime in Chicago, you're kind of like, really? Like all of Chicago? Like that seems a little unrealistic given how huge Chicago is. Now, if it's superhero crime drama, then yeah, Kingpin can control all the crime in Chicago. That's fine. That's one guy. It doesn't matter. But if it's supposed to be a gritty Elmore Leonard novel, more realistically, this is one of many people who is involved in crime in Chicago, right? Tony Soprano is believable because he has to answer to the New York families, not just to other people in New Jersey, right? So I think that across our games, right, whether it's Cartel or Root or Avatar or Bluebeard's Bride, we're always thinking about what is the necessary world building for the genre that we're in. And the kind of work that Andy's talking about, of kind of rooting things, it really is great for fantasy, for epic fantasy, for psychological travel stories where you're braving the elements and thinking about the resources you have or don't have. But I think that there's something here of really choosing the right paintbrushes for the kind of work that you're doing. Are you making an oil painting? Are you doing watercolors? Are you sketching in ballpoint pen? There's no right answer. That's your choice as an artist, right? But it's not even your style. It's the project you're undertaking, right? So what is the necessity to build? So next week we're going to be launching a Kickstarter a crowdfunding campaign on BackerKit for a product called Rapscallion, which is from this amazing creator Whistler. She's a writer, designer, artist. Like she's just absolutely triple threat cool person. And her view of the Great Sea, which is this pirate setting for this game, is like bonkers, just wild, like stuff I never would have come up with. Stuff like books that come to life because you've written them with Leviathan ink blood, and like every single pirate is weird. Like you're an undead pirate lord or a cyclops, or you made a deal with a demon that lives inside you, and all these characters are like bigger than life. And I keep looking at it and thinking, man, I never would have come up with this because I'm so much more the person who's like, but what's the trade policy of the port that they're going to? And Evanly's like, who cares? This is the port at which you drink magic potions at the local bar, and everything is at this crazy level. So I think that really finding your genre for this project, for this work, finding your paintbrushes for yourself, world building has to be a tool. It's not a straitjacket that everybody's going to judge you for if you don't get it right. But it is a promise that you're making. And the sort of Game of Thrones jokes where somehow this raven flies at the speed of light to get a message to John, at this particular, but we only care about that because there's a betrayal, because there was a promise made earlier that the world was going to play according to these rules. And so you really think before you start, what rules do I want to commit to? What level of authenticity do I hate the word realism because it's all stories, right? What level of authenticity am I committing to? And I'm excited to pass it to Brian because he probably has lots of thoughts about this. What am I committing to when I start? And one of the big questions in Cartel I had when I started was, okay, it's Mexican narco fiction. There's a lot of magical realism in Mexican culture. Like I'm very familiar and comfortable with magical realism. Is Cartel going to be a game in which there is some magic? And as I worked on the game and developed it, I was like, no, it can't work that way. There can't be a way to bring someone back from the dead or evade this problem with magic. It needs to all be humans doing human stuff with human limitations in the real world, because otherwise I think it's going to be disconnected from all of the moral choices we have to make. And I think that one thing, Brian, you made me think of in your last answer was we really think about morality and legality when we think about resources, right? And crime fiction is often the space where the two have the most divergence. And so to some degree, all of these questions, genre questions, are about, choices like, is the law in your game a representation of the will of a good king and therefore to be respected, and the villains are those who break the law? Or is your genre crime fiction in which law is just the tool of the elites to define and constrict the world, and breaking from it only indicates that you might have a different morality than the one enforced by those with power? Those are really different spaces and demand really different tools.
Absolutely. And this gets us into all of those questions of, genre and agency and influence, all that stuff that we on World Anvil we set up in the meta of your world. Like it's so critical to have an understanding of that going in, so you don't accidentally talk about trade policies when you're supposed to be talking about drinking magic potions and using Leviathan ink. Like it creates the disconnect. If you don't know what you're doing going in, it can cause you a lot of problems. No, I totally agree. Brian, your final tips for our world builders on this knotty subject.
Oh no, I absolutely loved what you guys were saying about all of that stuff. I actually had a couple of thoughts, kind of in regard to something each of them said. So I love this idea of looking at what it is, trying to keep perspective of what you're trying to do as the author, as the game designer, as whatever. And this is something I still struggle with. I'm 12 years into a career writing epic fantasy, and this is a thing that I still break down on, where I will often lose track of the level of conflict that my characters should be having. And when I say that, I mean, I write military epic fantasy, lots of political intrigue, lots of big ideas, lots of big battles. And there are times when I suddenly will get bogged down writing a scene where for some reason my brain says, oh, well, this whole scene is going to be about this character not having enough money to buy a thing. And then I've written a scene about a character worrying about money in this massive epic fantasy where I need to keep things moving. Like, this person not having pocket change does not matter to the conflict. It really doesn't. And maybe it does for the story you're telling. It really depends on kind of the level of perspective you're looking for. And so, I'll do that all the time. And it kind of drives me nuts that I still do it, where I'll look at something really micro. I'll introduce a conflict that is so small compared to all the other conflicts around that it just derails the entire plot line. And that's something you kind of want to think about whether this conflict that you're introducing, and that conflict can be in regards to resources. It can be in regards to any kind of level of love or politics or whatever. Try to make sure that conflict fits in the world that you're writing. And that was really kind of like, I loved when Andy was talking about cutting down the number of trade resources. That's exactly what I started thinking about, was really, when we're designing these worlds, we cannot design them entirely how the real world works. The real world is so massively huge that you can't introduce that many characters. You can't introduce that many variables. It's just, you don't have enough paper for that. I mean, you look at George R. R. Martin's books, and he really tries hard to do it, and he still doesn't have enough characters. He doesn't have enough conflicts to really reflect our real world. So don't try to keep it focused on the conflicts you're trying to explore. And when you find yourself ballooning in all these different directions, you just try to pull it back a little bit and focus.
Absolutely. Folks, please throw a clap into the chat for my ever fantastic guests. Today, you have been hearing from the amazing Andy Law. Go check him out on the Rookery. The amazing Brian McClellan. Go check him out at brianmcclellan.com. And the amazing Mark Truman. Go check out Magpie Games. They do wonderful things. Folks, everybody on the screen here, thank you so very much for your wonderful answers, for these beautifully varied perspectives that I feel have all somehow miraculously come into a wonderful lesson on approaching trade and resources. And guys, the learning is not done. No, in 15 minutes, yes, you have 15 minutes, we have our final session of the day. We have the ever wonderful Tracy Hickman, yes, that Tracy Hickman, co-creator of Dragonlance and the infamous Strahd, is coming to talk to us about creating better characters. He was our keynote speaker last year. He made us all cry. I am so excited for this panel, folks. Join us in 15 minutes for Creating Better Characters, the last panel for the seminar of the day. And in the meantime, have some world building thoughts. See you soon. Bye.